you were talking about the traditional roles between men and women, and a lot of textile roles were actually done by men, but it's only over the years that we've associated textile work with women's work. So it's kind of weird because at one point everybody in the household would spin, everybody would weave. It was just part of daily life because you had to survive, right? In the evenings you would work in the field and then you'd come home, you'd sit by the fire, share stories, and you'd spin or you would weave. Because if you didn't, you had no way of clothing yourself, right? And yes, sewing is usually associated with women's work, and usually associated with women in handwork. And handwork is always associated with women. But it hasn't always historically been the case, which I think is interesting. And there are different artists that are, like Mike Kelly, for example, he's working with playing around with gender stereotypes and taking on a role that everybody thinks as being feminine, but is actually, it should be, I think it should be, completely gender neutral. And so with Sweetness of the Work at the AGM, it's playing around with the handwork of sewing. So in the front display case, those little bobbins and hand sewing kits, or a needle kit, is basically what you'd use for hand sewing, and then the large sewing machine is more of an industrial size sewing apparatus, I guess, large sewing machine, and it's a Singer sewing machine from 1901. So I traced the serial number on them. Back then, every sewing machine, and still today, they all have serial numbers, so you can go back and read the history of your sewing machine. So this one's dated 1901, and it came up from the States. I don't exactly know the entire history of the piece, of the sewing machine, because it was a donation. But I have one in my family that's been passed down over generations, and this one's almost exactly the same as the one that my grandmother used to sew on. And my grandmother then taught me how to sew. So in a lot of handwork and in a lot of women's work, there's this beautiful tradition of passing down skill. And so when I look at this particular machine, I wonder how many people learned to sew on it, and exactly where it was kept, and who owned it, and what did they sew. What were they really avid sewers? Sometimes, especially today, a lot of people have a sewing machine, but they don't necessarily know how to use it. They have one because they hope that they're going to. Was this the case with this particular sewing machine? Right? And so it's been covered in paper first. It's a Japanese tissue paper called Gampi tissue. So I wrap the machine in tissue paper and then expose it to a salt solution. And the salt solution has been boiled on the stove. And I oversaturate the solution, so pour way too much salt in. So when it boils, the salt starts to create a really, really saline solution, and it crystallizes on the surface of the water. And then I pour that into a large vat. And in the case of Sweetness of the Work, because the pieces are so large, I had to create my own vats out of concrete block and a liner. So I had these large, almost like a hot tub, bathtub type thing in my studio kitchen, and poured this boiling water salt solution over top of the sewing machine that had been covered in paper. As the water cooled, the salt came out of the solution and started to crystallize on the machine and on the paper, and it stayed in there for probably anywhere between 48 hours to a week. It really depends. Sometimes I do the process 2 or 3 times, depending on the effect. Like the actual sewing machine, I salted it twice, but a lot of the other components I just salted it once. Salt, as you say, is traditionally used as a preservation tool. Historically, it was used to pay people. It was used as a monetary, almost like money. The War of 1812, I believe, was paid. They paid the soldiers in salt because it was used it was such an important part of daily life, and it was really, really valuable. If you didn't have salt, you couldn't survive a winter, or you would die. I mean, when we sweat salt. It's just part of who we are as human beings, and we have a need for salt. So yes, it was used traditionally to preserve materials like meat, and to cure food and that kind of thing. which I think is interesting when you put it and apply it to a sewing machine. As we were saying earlier, that not a lot of people sew these days, and so it's almost like there's a need to preserve these traditional hand tools. Almost like by wrapping them in salt, we can preserve them. But what's actually going to happen is the sewing machine is going to rust and going to break down. So years from now, there's not going to be a sewing machine left. There's just going to be a pile of rust, and that very much speaks to the rusting away of handwork. That nobody's practicing handwork anymore. The skills are rusting, and when you break your arm and you have to go through weeks of treatment, your body it atrophies. Basically, your muscles start to not become used to working and functioning. And this is almost the same thing, that the sewing machine is handwork itself is atrophying over time. If you don't practice it, your body's not going to know how to keep your stitches even. There's a lot of repetitive nature that goes into handwork, and a lot of it is muscle memory. And if it's not practiced, it will atrophy, and you just won't have that same body knowledge of how to make anymore. And even as a society, the skills and knowledge is usually passed down from maker to maker and from generation to generation. And if nobody's practicing anymore, those oral traditions that are very much an integral part of textile history won't be passed down anymore. So we won't have that sort of repository of knowledge to draw from when we make, because nobody's making. So I think what it comes down to is sort of the differentiation between art and craft, and what is associated with craft is usually associated with women, and what's associated with art is usually associated with men. In society today, women generally go into what are kind of associated as the soft skills. Women can teach, women can nurse. Women can do anything they want, but generally there are set roles. You have a male contractor and you have a female teacher. And historically that's been when women first went into the workplace, there were certain set tasks for women to do. And so women are generally seen as being of the hand, and craft is generally made by hand, and it's generally based on touch. And women in society, it's more acceptable for women to touch than for men to touch, hence the creation of women-based roles or women-based jobs versus men or male jobs. We get the creation of perspective historically in the Renaissance, and that's generally seen as the mind, or it's generally seen of the mind. You get a vanishing point. You get thought involved. It's not as emotional. It's not of the hand as craft is. So therefore, it's seen as women's work, whereas of the mind, painting, men, perspective, is generally seen as man's work. What you get men who are generally seen as the oil painters and the great oil painters, and they're painting and they're creating something of the mind, and women are creating something that's of the hand that can be used, that has a function. Oil painting doesn't have a function, right? It's to decorate. You could argue and say that oil painting has a function in that you hang it on your wall and it's beautiful. It also functions to serve as documentation of what was going on at that particular time. But what they're painting, generally in an oil painting, in an historical oil painting, is craft-based work, right? So I find that that's interesting, that they're documenting craft-based work or craft-based processes. You get some beautiful pictures of women sewing by an open window. They're painting craft, right? And so the separation between art and craft is very, very interesting and very, very muddled, and very much a part of our social breakdown between genders, I guess. And I don't think that, I think gender is part of the piece, but the sweetness of the work. And I would not necessarily call myself a feminist, but I think it raises some interesting questions associated with gender, just because as a society we have these preconceived notions of male and female work.
What you've done with these sewing implements by preserving them in salt is you've and someone mentioned this to me recently, is that now they're useless in a sense. And was that part of the decision to kind of, I wouldn't say elevate, but kind of turn this object of craft into art?
Much so, very much so. I think that was part of it. They become specimens. They become preserved. They become a sort of a snapshot of what was of the work that went into it. They, as you say, they are useless. They're no longer functional. I mean, if you could knock the salt off them, they might function again. But it is very much a looking at taking something that is craft based or used in craft and putting it into more of an art based context by putting it into a gallery that usually galleries are associated with art. And craft, again, has a function, and so you usually see craft in the home or out on the street. People are wearing it. It doesn't often get the same respect that art does, or the same, I'm not sure respect is the right term, it may be recognition. Craft is often unrecognized because we live with it every day. We don't see the beauty in the pouring of a teapot. There's so much attention and so much work that goes into creating a beautiful teapot, but we take it for granted at 6 o'clock in the morning when all we need is a shot of caffeine, right? And we don't see the craft